Hello everyone, today we talk about cultural vanguards in the early Middle Ages. Essentially we're gonna give a look, broadly speaking, at the literary or even intellectual horizons of the early medieval elites between roughly the 6th and the 11th century. There are a couple of videos I've already made that can work well as an introduction to this. Just recently I made literacy in early medieval Europe that deals also in part with not just with literacy itself, but also discussing the centers of cultural production. And if you go into my medieval society playlist, I'm sure you can find else. Maybe not so much about the strictly early medieval times, now that I think about it, but everything in that playlist is kind of useful to understand, broadly speaking, what was the context of this the context we're talking about. So, as you know, especially if you have been following me from some time, I don't like to make essentially a ranking of eras, as if there were periods that were better or worse than others, or that had an intrinsic value more than that. I'm actually very passionate about early medieval times, although I eventually, for for personal reason, ended up to study the low Middle Ages in my the most. But I'm still very sensitive when it gets to the early medieval times, because they're probably some of the most misunderstood and still pretty incorrectly pictured, probably obviously at the popular level, if you want. We today we will naturally draw a relatively we'll see, but it's obvious that the early medieval time. By the way, we're talking essentially about Latin-Germanic Europe, so we're gonna stick to the West, and we will see practically both how the essentially the early medievals, what the early medievals had maintained as a cultural legacy of the classical world at this point. So essentially, which authors and works were present in the arsenal of the early medieval intellectual, which is also an enormous task to do. This is something that could take an entire university course, not even class, to explain, and I can't do that, so we're gonna compress for a 2 hours video, and essentially how the early medieval intellectuals managed to capitalize upon this, and how to build, how to develop, and so on. Because the picture can be disheartening. It's obvious that early medieval times saw the say a world that had lost a lot from the past. However, the key points to really approach this period are essentially two. The first one is, I was saying, looking at the context, looking at what society was. So I'm not saying, oh well, as those positivistic, progressivistic-oriented people say, like, oh, the medieval times was such a dark period, it was a mess, and so on, because it's so popular. I mean, really popular in the probably in the negative sense of the word, which is otherwise positive in other terms. There is still this kind of positivistic view of history. That is something, fortunately, in the academies we've gone past, fortunately, simply because it belongs to a past like the Enlightenment. It is a bit ridiculous to keep sticking to, in spite of what all that it gave to us naturally, but we can't conceive history as essentially a moment that has to be criticized with our very subjective moral standards, by the way, because even if we wanted to make, in fact, to be morally objective, you can't, and this is the point I'm making, we can't judge the past in these terms. I mean, you can't understand what early medieval literature was if you don't understand what early medieval times practically were. The availability of resources that were pretty poor. The crop rate was definitely pretty poor. A world that had contracted, by the way, for reasons that laid within the ancient world, not the early medieval one as such. The early medieval one is, in a sense, just a result. Secondly, and probably also more interestingly, it's really to look at what these people did at the time, with the means they had. That is extraordinary, and even early medieval literature, maybe, I don't know, I hope on Schwerpunkt we will arrive to discuss that at some point as well. It's definitely extremely rich, extremely varied, extremely effervescent, extremely innovative. And of course, if we compare what would happen in even from high medieval times that we're essentially looking at even today, but also naturally in low medieval, late medieval times that are naturally something where we have always to be, in fact, mindful of the context, because given the amount of works and informations that existed, probably early medieval times were even more original and innovative than later medieval times would be. And this is actually normal, because it's as if you are comparing two systems, one of which is simpler, one of which is extremely greater, and it's obvious even for sheer physical terms that much more energy is much more structural elements are let's say much more energy are gonna be lost in the greater system that has more attrition, so it has to rely paradoxically on greater approximations to naturally look in perspective as greater systems, more complex systems, but there actually were probably less analytical, more. Yeah, of course, it had also in here another other achievements, but early medieval times were much deeper intellectually than we can think, much more. If you read works like the one of Gregory of Tours or Isidore of Seville or Bede the Venerable, Paul the Deacon, you realize these were great minds, and I really mean great minds. It is even difficult sometimes to say, wow, these were early medievals. Wow, these guys looked really much more. They were much more intelligent than me, indeed. And naturally, these were great minds that wrote great things, but obviously there was much else. But this is also normal, at all times in history, and this is also give the context. Geniuses existed at all times, because that's something statistical and biologically statistical, and it's really the context that eventually makes the difference in many ways. And also education, in this sense, is not something you have to give for granted. In early medieval times, education was not given for granted, and that's also why it was a matter of greater ambition. Just think, even given in terms of resources, how many books still circulated in early medieval times, and how costly that practically was from a material point of view. I mean, making a manuscript was like having a Ferrari. Owning a manuscript was like having a Ferrari today. And this love for knowledge, this love for trying to understand the world for what it was. It was something was felt. And by the way, the early medievals were perfectly aware of what had happened before them. I mean, naturally, yes, not everybody was like that, but something we often forget about medieval times is that that it was not a Renaissance invention to stick to the Roman models. The medievals loved the classical world. They knew that there had been. Obviously, they had their misconceptions. They didn't have the history we have today. Much starts again from humanism again, but there was a conscience that the world had changed, and this is not a few, as an acknowledgement for a civilization. And this myth of the sleeping Middle Ages, for which there was no one who studied, no one who read, nobody who had interest, is probably one of the most idiotic concepts by any standard that you can come up with looking at this time. If you only know a little bit of medieval literature and how things worked at the time. So I'm trying hard to dispel this myth, and not even really to embellish the situation for what it was. Believe me, if there is something that I'm trying to tell it how it was. Obviously, nobody can tell the truth in the first place. We don't know how to reach it, but given what we have from history, I try always to deliver you something that is as objective as possible, at least for my abilities, of course. Then this doesn't mean I succeed, but let's try this. So, a first and essential point to make, just to give a bit of orientation, is that talking about early medieval literature, you realize that the cultural production really rarely surpassed the limits, the boundaries of the religious education of the clergy. This is a very important point. This didn't. This doesn't mean that there weren't educated laymen at all. There were. It's simply that they also here it's complicated. We'll discuss it another time, maybe, and the relation between the lay and ecclesiastical culture at this time that did exist, by the way, because this was the same society. The clergy was not isolated from the rest of society, but generally speaking, it was really the clergy that wrote most of the things we have, from at least up to it depends, really up to the low Middle Ages, probably, because eventually, especially in certain areas of Europe, the production mostly started to be a lay one. And it is very interesting because, in this sense, there were areas of Europe that were completely different one from the other, that had a complete different development, social organization than others. It's obvious that if you read, a 14th century Italian chronicle, city chronicle, and you read a 14th century Flemish chronicle, you realize that there is an abyss between the two things. It's as if there were, 2 centuries of distance, given the mindset level of development level, and this naturally has to do with the degree of social complexity. Not just that, it's also it's not exclusively that, it's really also how society was segmented in practice. But for instance, I'm a great lover of chronicles, and I know that especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, there is this stereotype that the chronicle sucks because it's always subjective, it has always an agenda, is always writing for someone. And this is a typical Northern European cliché, because indeed it is true that in Northern Europe there were less, there are first of all more ecclesiastical sources, or at least history was made mostly still by ecclesiastical chronicles, not only at that, but and in this sense these clergymen were writing for someone, and this is evident. But this is a matter of society, because if you have a kingdom, if you have a principality, if you have a court, for instance, you're a literate of that court, you're gonna write for that court. That's pretty obvious. But if you go in another context that is like, in fact, a city-state where there are many factions, there are many, people are, by the way, usually even better educated, because they get educated especially about things that are very concrete, because these are merchants who know what the hell is happening all over Europe with wars and politics and so on. They have capitals invested there. It's obvious that you're going to have, first of all, a much more pragmatic and realistic mindset, and secondly, they're going to be more objective. Naturally, objectivity here is also here cannot really fully be achieved, but there is a big difference between writing for a guy who pays you, essentially. Another thing is writing because you want to keep an account of what is happening in your house, in your city, in your region, to leave to your family, to other people like you, you meet like friends that are, I don't know, merchants or people with a certain degree of education. So we should never really look just at saying, the canonical, this perspective is wrong. Is obviously these were not really free thinkers as we imagined them, although sometimes it can get close to this. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Like in the case of the merchant, for instance, who was writing for utility. But we should never be tricked by the idea that what is written at a given time is just an agenda. It's just a narrative designed for some subjective because someone paid you for depicting another version of the story. And actually, especially when you confrontate several sources, you study a period, look in many versions of the story, you realize you're able to understand, look, these might have all objectively told the story their own way, like everybody does, by the way. But there is still that thing in common that is pretty evident, it's out there, so it's pretty difficult. It's going to be a myth about invention. And the problem is, in fact, when you get to early medieval times and you have a very few sources to compare, and then you might start wondering about the reliability of this. But the way you have to approach literature in these centuries is rather not about what is told, because it's obvious that history is not made just quoting a source and pretending it's right. History, as many people believe, by the way, this was written, it's a source, it's written, so it's historical. Then it's historical in the sense that that it's historiography, but it in the academy, we take these things and we analyze them for what they are, not because because we believe that what they say is true. And probably the greatest and the most precious details you can get from these sources is indeed what these sources are talking about in the first place and how they're doing it, and a lot of details that naturally can be so useful for looking at this world and understanding what. And this is a bit, it leaves it's sweet and bitter at the same time, because it's like when you study, I don't know, just take the Battle of Hastings, just for saying a random example of things that happened in the Middle Ages. If you read how many sources are there for the Battle of Hastings, like, I mean, of that contemporary sort of like 2, 3, or no, there's something even came later. I mean, what did happen at the Battle of Hastings? You think we know what happened at the Battle of Hastings? Given those 3 sources, nobody knows what happened at the Battle of Hastings. And this can be mind-blowing, because you say, but wait, so what we're being told is wrong. No, it's not really wrong, not necessarily. It's simply that we can't verify that. And this is pretty serious, because when you make a you carry out a survey, an investigation, say you probably want to find out what is true, given thinking in a tribunal. I mean, I don't know, with case, people want to figure out what it is. If you don't have a proof, you can't objectively do anything about it. This is how our law works. And history does basically the same. We have many hints most of the times that really tell us so much about the world situation. And paradoxically, it's mostly from those hints that we make history rather than actual facts. But in the case of the Battle of Hastings, really, before, in this sense, in understanding what really happened in that battle, from a tactical story, for a tactical history of the battle, what we get is, what those people wanted us to let us know, essentially. What they wanted to let us know about that thing. Certain detail, if you take the Bayeux tapestry, that's not just something random came out of there. It's actually a big thing. And we have such an extraordinary depiction of the Norman conquest of England from the Bayeux Tapestry, but we have so few sources in general about what Battle of Hastings practically was, about what the invasion actually, how the invasion actually occurred and why. Because what the great lesson you understand from this is that society didn't deem necessary to write more than what was written at the time. There is also to say that think about the oral accounts that were still very important, were still songs, was still a world that relied on the oral tradition pretty heavily. But essentially, probably you can understand much more about looking at those Norman knights as they were represented on the tapestry, and look at them and say, wow, this is how these people really thought of themselves to be, and this is what they left us. So what is important is really to know about how that fight, that combat really happened, and Hastings, or that they wanted to let us know, or is it those beautiful Norman knights fighting all together, really in line with that warrior ethos, with that mindset, with that appearance that they really wished us to let us know after 1,000 years. I get emotional when I talk about these things, because I don't know what is with history or with me, but I realize there are many other people who sense this, but it's what these people wanted to let us know. This is heartbreaking, if you think about it. Something I don't even know how to describe. To make something survive to the tempests of time, for a life, by the way, that today we live a fairly okay life. Those people struggled in a way, and nevertheless they let us what they left us what they did, in the hope that it would be remembered like that, in the hope that someone like us would look at the past and say, my God, those people were like this, and let's remember them. This is the greatness of history. This is why it will, doesn't matter what happens in my life, I will keep learning history forever, because you never end, and you never end, and you have no reason to end, because it's those people talking to you from the past. It's as if they poked you on the shoulder saying, look, we were here, look at what we have done, because this can help you. And this is how I look at history, and it's very, I realize it's very personal, it's very also kind of spiritual. I don't know you want to define it, but I think all of us can look at the past, and this is the greatness of history, that we can all learn from it. It doesn't take to be a historian, because we are all historians in some measure. We are historians ever since we are born, or even before being born, because we still have the sensibility, perception, with the senses. We have constantly to figure out what is happening around us. This means to be a historian. It's a philosophical state, of existential state of being, and it's important to look far, to look beyond, to extend your horizons, also backwards in the past, to understand so many things that can be useful to you. So forgive me this kind of philosophical rant. Let's drink it in a bit. So this is the first point. The religious education of the clergy is a key starting point for understanding early medieval literature. Another remark, maybe also here it's a bit sad overall, is that during the 6th and the 11th century, those elements of especially late Roman um, classic, let's say, classicism, were preserved in part, and to be transmitted and enriched with new, new, also new prompts, let's say, new, only with great difficulty. This is important because it's as if it gave you the it's as if it was the reflection of the economical potential, the technological potential of the time. Something, early medieval times didn't have this huge sprint. Indeed, it was they essentially originated by a time of desolating contraction at so many levels, and then it took really a lot and a very progressive process to eventually start for European society to start rising once again. So this is reflected also into literature, because the moment of contraction that had existed more or less dramatically, more or less abruptly, between late Roman, let's say late antiquity and early medieval times, something that definitely saw the loss of so many works. And this loss is often very dramatically described as it was a very dark thing that happened. Someone actively destroyed this classical knowledge. Sometimes this happened indeed. There were times in which even the Christian world, that there would be a lot of talking about this. I made some here some videos that deal essentially what the relation of Christianity was with classical culture, and it was definitely a complex one, but after all, I think it was overall positive. It's sad as it can be, indeed, the rise of Christianism, so also the destruction of many classical works. We have to be honest about this, but really the way it happened is less dramatic than we want to picture. I know that these topics can get easily very, or at least they're often used in a very political way. Even in movies, etc., there is a tendency to depict this as mostly as a contrast. I can say that historiographically speaking, this is not conceived usually like this. It's a much more complex process that brought unavoidably to an osmotic and hybrid process. Here's the video I wanted to advise you if you're interested. It's called Christian and Classical Culture in Late Antiquity. So you can go look at that if you're interested. It's in my Medieval Christianity playlist that deals partly with these problems. But more in general, and this is really the main structural factor that brought to that, is that the loss of so many classical works didn't happen because someone actively destroyed them at all. There were also a lot of wars, a lot of destruction, of physical destructions also that were some kind of accidental. If you burn a city, you're gonna burn also libraries in the process, so this can happen. Also, this wasn't really the standard, because, by the way, as we know, the late antique times, as this prosecution of the classical world into its progressive decline, was still a very, say, a relatively high literate world. There were at least lots of works that were preserved in a way or in another. There is a lot of problem also of writing supports on which you write, because the papyrus is easily perishable. By the way, it's only in early medieval times that, especially when the West got a bit cut off from the from the east, they started lacking papyrus to write on, so they had to recur to the vellum, to the membrana, that was enormously more costly than the papyrus. And this brought, in fact, also to the contraction of book production. So it actually was a series of factors, but especially there is the lack of interest. Indeed, if you are abandoning the cities, if you only you are concerned is to survive at one point, or either by fleeing the invasions, the wars, the destructions, or simply because you need to work the land, otherwise you're going to starve to death, you're not going to be extremely interested in reading, and you're not even getting the chance of getting educated. So inherently, even a few generations, you can't lose any interest in getting educated, because it's not vital for you in the first place. I mean, it had never been vital, arguably, because this form of education had stemmed essentially from a surplus of a very, say, wealthy world that, however, is still pretty much oligarchic. So, yeah, I know in Roman times people were generally educated. It was a high level of literacy, etc. But it wasn't really about being an extreme intellectual development. It just was about, the average was about, for those who had gone to school, which were not probably even the majority in Rome at the peak of Roman times during the Antonines. You knew essentially how to read and how to write, and how to count, how to deal with numbers, but in a very superficial way. I mean, it wasn't like a world where everybody read, in the sense that they were all philosophers that stayed there studying books every day. No, because also in ancient times, after all, life was pretty meager. Anyway, so it was a very different world, very different relation with culture. And besides the literacy in early medieval Europe that addresses also partly of these aspects of the Roman world, I made another video. It can be interesting for you. It's called Transformation of the West, 3rd to 6th century. There also deals a little bit to see how progressively this world, especially in Western Europe, that is one we're talking about today, contracted a little bit. So it's obvious that in this world where there were few prompts for for the society to change in the first place, it's obvious that also literature was intellectual development and criticism was relatively rare, and that the few times when this happened definitely was exceptional, and nevertheless we still have that. And probably, and this is also a point, there is, however, a world like that we can't see because it didn't leave us much of a historical trace, let's say, that however was still probably more active than we can think. If you take the Romano-Germanic kingdoms in the West, indeed there was a process of acculturation even in those centuries that were arguably the darkest one, as they're depicted as the Dark Ages, because indeed you realize at a certain point these Germanic elites, that by the way were mixing definitely with the Roman ones, began to, for instance, put their laws, to write their laws down, to start building an administration, and you realize that in that sense there was probably a big world we don't know much about, because a few has survived in terms of sources, but that still existed. It still maintained some sources that read them, that speculated on them, and that tried to answer the needs of that world also through that classical heritage. That was definitely prized and appreciated. There's never been a time in the history of the Western world where people said, oh, classical literature doesn't matter anymore at all. There might have been worlds that didn't know about it, or that didn't get interested about it, especially if you were not literate. take everything east of the Rhine to be even to be optimistic, by the way, because also west of the Rhine, pretty much, who wasn't such a high literacy. But it's obvious that, I don't know, in 7th century Scandinavia, just a very few people might have been able to read, but in first place, this is the point, had the reason to do it. Because if you don't have the reason, you don't do it. It's called intelligence, and it's called civilization in its own way, because it's not just about reading, it's doing a freaking lot of other things that eventually allowed those who came in the following centuries to actually even capitalize upon it and being able to study, to read once again. So never underestimate the structural, allowance, let's say, that what the structure allowed to be produced, because that's how how literature also is produced. If you don't have a guy who can afford to sit at a desk studying, so someone else essentially working, making food for him, there's something extremely evident in this sense. You can't have a scholar. So we should be also pretty mindful about in today's times that, even the poorest branches of our societies in the West are still enormously wealthier than these guys had been. It's not naturally a reason to accept it, but it's a reason it's a way to look at those people in the past and say, okay, that's really bad, and given what we have, we can do much better in any condition we are essentially today. And it seems to me that today's world is getting used to this idea that that something is owed to you in the first place, instead than actually making that something. So this is also very political in nature, but it's pretty obvious. We don't have, our houses, our properties, our what we have, if someone didn't work for them. How we can get them for free? Doesn't make sense. Of course, yeah, I know the technology is advanced, and kind of, robots are doing most of things for us at a certain point, but this still doesn't mean that we have to sit doing nothing if we really want to progress, if we really want to make the world better, because ultimately we're still in a time in history when it takes a freaking lot of work to get things done. And in this sense, we should learn from people in the past who had much less than we do, but did a terrific job. And this is why I love so much the early Middle Ages, because these provide essentially some of the best examples. A lot of digressions today, I'm sorry, but I try to engage you also in other different ways. So this was just a premise. It lasted like 38 minutes. So talking about especially the works that were, so which works really did survive from the ancient world at this time in the Latin West, in the Latin-Germanic West. So at the beginning of the 6th century, so there was this massive contraction of the contacts with the East. The Western Roman Empire had fallen. Not a big deal, actually. The real crack, the real watershed happened substantially at the mid of the 6th century, so like 80 years later, actually, the fall of the West. Because at that point, with the plague, with the wars of reconquest of the empire, but this seems to have existed in the whole Eurasia as a major structural, and not just in them, as main structural factor. Communications contracted, demography went down, economy shrank. So this moment of great contraction, indeed. I think contraction is best term, even more than decline, because decline is this kind of linear view of the thing that doesn't really render how it really happened. This contraction that naturally happened in different ways in different times, but it was overall the general tendency. and it was a contraction that mostly, actually, all of Europe felt. We can't say it was just about the West. The more I read about Byzantine history, the more I realize how similar actually the two halves of Europe really were, given that they weren't really halves, because there was also the north, the east, and other, let's say, differences within these same groupings, but this was the tendency. And the main problem at this point is that trade collapsed. Now, trade had been in the ancient world like the gluing factor of that kept a bit the empire, not really that kept the empire together, but that allowed, especially from a cultural point of view, knowledge to be shared. Naturally, the Roman Empire had very solid structural basis. It lasted for a freaking long time. It's an extraordinary achievement that it managed to last even for so long. And then there is naturally the Eastern continuation for another millennium. So something should always be minded. And I also don't like this idea of watershed, of ending of the Roman world, because actually, if you look at early medieval times, it was still a Roman world in so many ways, and it arguably always remained such. Expanding also into those places where the Roman Empire had not, extended its direct control, even through culture, indeed. But it is evident that in the 6th century there is a brutal contraction, especially in the West, of trade with the East. So the point is that the East had remained at that point a bit more dynamic, culturally speaking, not because the West was so backwards as is often said. Actually, the Western elites were way more educated than the Eastern ones, but these elites were like extremely few people. The Eastern ones were instead, I say, first of all, being drawn from more like the middle class, or at least a middle class that was becoming upper class, also through meritocracy, bureaucracy, etc. And it was a world that was on average more literate than the West. It was also shaping itself from an ideological point of view on the basis of classical knowledge, as in Byzantine administration. For instance, if you wanted to make a career, you had to be necessarily educated, like having studied the Odyssey, the Iliad, Virgil. So it really went all like this perpetual looking at the past that would characterize the Byzantine world, and in these even kind of sclerotic models at a certain point. Also, they have to be understood why it was like that, because eventually also society kind of crystallized in that world. But otherwise, up to that point, culture being kind of effervescent, fluid, original, and so on. So the main problem with this process is that the West kind of lost touch with this most educated East, and the literary canons, essentially, of the classical texts froze, in the sense that what was saved at that point in the West was to remain practically unchanged as the amount of classical works that existed for 4 centuries, sometimes even up to the Renaissance, because certain works were not known in Europe, even up to early medieval Europe, back from the classical past, where instead they had existed in the same Western regions. Even though naturally also in here we have to be a bit more precise, because let's be honest about it, humanism and the Renaissance are overrated by a lot. It was a massive phenomenon, quantitatively speaking, also partly in quality, but it really came on the shoulders of what had started to happen chiefly from the 12th century in Europe. And I made recently actually a lot of videos about this topic that I also care about very much. Can give you maybe some title. One is 12th century Western translations from Greek and Arabic. That is definitely fascinating. Scientific revival of the West, 10th, 13th century, a point on medieval technology. It also deals, however, with this more strictly literary problems. There is one I've done about the 12th century Renaissance. 12th century Renaissance and introduction. This is a bit of a smaller video than the ones I did before, but there is a lot actually also about I made recently this video, the cultural influence of medieval Islam, that is very interesting, especially if you read it if you listen to it in tandem with the one of the 12th century translations from Greek and Arabic, and I plan to definitely expand still in this view. So, however, sticking to the timeline of the 6th, 11th century we gave us today, this is the point. It's as if, at a certain point the source of classical texts got cut off, and basically the West relied on its own. Naturally, this is a bit more complicated than we can expect. First of all, the West didn't cut contact with the East at all. This is a brutal and quite even a brutal approximation at best, let's say, and it's very anti-historical. The West always maintained a contact, and a pretty intense one also with the East, especially with the Byzantine East, but also with the Islamic world, so this is not really true. Once again, it's a problem of what the West could absorb at this point. If there was no demand, no request for reading, people were not interested. And what you see, in fact, is that in the following times, in the High Middle Ages, it was the same Western Europeans that it's not that they simply passively came across books from the classical times that, I don't know, the Arabs or the Byzantines gave to them. It was the same Westerners who actively went to search for those books in Constantinople, in the Arab world, and starting translating them autonomously because they were thirsty of knowledge for eminently pragmatic reasons, practical reasons, and they often went in search for these information, for this knowledge, because they had other progressed knowledge they wanted to integrate this in. So the myth that it was the West that one day woke up because someone brought them classical texts is a very childish approximation as well. And the West was rocketing by itself on its own at a structural level, which was a massive, very deep one, deeply rooted one, since at least Carolingian times, or even before, given the potential that theoretically existed in Western Europe. So, giving finally a look to these texts, these were, we can't list them all, but there were roughly only, listen to this because it's important, there were 150 works. Yeah, of the whole ancient world, there were only 150 works. There is not really a few. I mean, I wish I personally knew everything about I was a specialist in those 150 works. If I had, I would love to, even indeed to get unavoidably eventually interested in these early medieval times through these works, because obviously we rarely have direct books from the ancient world. We mostly have all their medieval translations. So it's also interesting, philologically speaking, to see, how did this work get to us, because you realize it's thanks to the medievals if we have them as well. So thanks Benedictine monks, and this is as we were saying before, the relation with Christianity also is a bit complicated. Here it's when that thing about the clergy and their religious education is coming to play, because essentially why these 150 works? Is it that they had been lost, they had been destroyed, they had been burnt? Not really in that sense, because really the Christians were much more pragmatic at this time than we can imagine. Basically, all the fathers of the church had talked about was taken, it was copied in terms of classical works. So if, I don't know, St. Augustine had talked about a certain work, classical order, the early medieval Christian would essentially have preserved that, and the rest just went lost, just like everything went lost in those ages, all the time. There were many things that went lost in the same pagan world, say, of the and the what point was I making as well? And by the way, the fact that these works had been discussed by the fathers of the church also entails that definitely those Christians had been reading these classical sources and had appreciated them at the point of integrating them. If you I had the fortune to study something that I strangely liked a lot in Ecology, is the history of the of ancient and medieval libraries. And what you realize that when the first Christians began to to come out from after the persecutions, and they started to live like, and to starting also access education and so on, you realize that the first Christian libraries had all pagan works with them. There's not a Christian library ever that never had a classical work. The Christians made indeed a huge work of integration of these works. So it's naive to pretend the Christian world was somewhat, I don't know, adverse or destructive of the classical. But unfortunately, we have this, I would say, I wouldn't even know how to call them in terms of prejudices. I mean, this idea that's the idea. Church was against science. This is the thing that like 50% of the people I meet assume as a dogma. This is absolutely false. Because first of all, science as we know it at the time did not exist. Because this is something that starts in the modern age. So science at the time was a mix of very weird things, including quite technical, also quite strictly scientific elements, but surrounded essentially by a world of fantasy, and science was mostly literature, as a matter of fact. So even the idea of the world was extremely non-scientific, even in the ancient world. At least in the ancient world, there was this undoubtedly important premise that was set in methodologically speaking, and in terms of the Greeks chiefly came up with in terms of categorization of encyclopedical knowledge. This was all inherited by the Christians, and science as we know it, also this is also very complicated, but it emerged also at one time that in which science was not that applicable. I mean, you might think, what was really in the 16th century that the I don't know, that people cared about whether the earth was revolving around the sun, or vice versa. What was the effective practice of that? And if you don't understand this, you can understand why certain things were adverse, because by that time it's something that could be denied, and it probably had more political impact than a strictly scientific one. So that's why certain thinkers were persecuted, and why indeed, and there was a damage into this, because there were countries that definitely damaged also their own economical potential and technological potential, that was rocketing in part, not really rocketing, but really increasing fast in the modern times. But also in there, it was a matter of political and social premise, more than strictly scientific one, because science, if you look at it, progresses always together with society. I mean, it's extremely, because science is something that permeates our entire lifestyle. It's not something you can get rid of, as if today I stop believing in science. People have always figured out science by themselves. They can have been more obstacled and so on, but when there is a massive evidence for in terms of knowledge for something that can be applied and it works, you see that in the history of mankind this was always applied and worked. And these naive readings of a history of technology, things like, I don't know, the Romans didn't develop the Greek steam engine because they had slavery and they were bad and they didn't care about technology. It's simply rubbish in history of technology terms. And every person who has a basic knowledge about that field knows it, that simply the classical world didn't have the potential to apply a steam engine and all of its components allegedly for doing what? For starving to death, for making collapse the Roman Empire like before than they did. What for? Slavery existed because there were certain dynamics that made it more profitable than investing on other things, and everybody kind of should know this. And so we'll still stick with these technologistic prejudices for which, I don't know, the church hated science, and the ancient were stupid because they used slavery instead of steam engines, and all these kind of childish ideas people unjustifiably still keep believing. Really, I have a very strong bias. You can't understand this, but it's so embarrassing to see how much people don't understand what was in nature, the science and the technology in ancient and medieval times, de facto, in terms of potential, which is a lack of scientific education, indeed, to think. Because if you think like that, you don't even understand how certain things work, and worked, and still work, by the way, at this time. So that technology is just an X factor that you can insert in every system and make it into rocket to the stars. It's not how it works. It's always the system that produces technology that serves to its own needs, gradually, every time this presents. This is how it works, more or less. And the things like the so-called scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and so on, were things that couldn't but be born in those specific times and contexts, because they had finally the premises for existing. And I'm not saying that, let's say, cultural and ideological factors do not count. They definitely count, but they're overall, in structural terms, kind of almost never, or at least in a very tiny part, on average, influencing these processes. So never think that here there was a destruction of knowledge, that the ancient world collapsed because of ignorance of the darkness in the medieval times, because today, if you go into a university and you say something like that, you're not gonna pass any history exam. And this is the point. And it's not because there are evil people who pretend to make you believe that. It's simply because the historical evidence tells us that, and the most refined historiographical theories tell us the exact opposite. And I realize we live in a world where our own achievements can be so fortunately great that not all the people actually can keep up with them. But at least my suggestion is that if you want to discuss something, being ignorant is no big deal. We are all ignorant by definition. I consider myself as an ignorant person myself, to be all the time, so that's telling the truth. But one thing is being ignorant, one thing is starting to talk about things that you don't know by pretending it's how you want it, and kind of imposing. You will be saying, oh, well, you're doing the same right now. Well, I wish I had more time to get much more in detail. Probably will because this is also a very complex topic. It's not evenly so simple as I tell you, but it's the whole results I'm talking to you about for what we can know historiographically speaking. So it's not something I'm forcing on you, because you're free you're obviously free to dissent for every single thing I say, but what are the bases of this? However, given these 150 works, it's not really a few, but it also depends what they talk about. Given these were actually works that were used in the imperial school. So if you wonder also in part how they were preserved, it's also because the Roman authorities had kept them as a sort of I wouldn't say official knowledge of the empire, but I mean these were names that had made the name of the empire from a literary point of view. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Terentius, Persius, Statius, Lucanus, Cicero, Quintilianus, Seneca, Donatus, Priscianus. So you realize mostly a properly classical times, just Donatus and Priscianus essentially belonging to the later empire, and then a collection of excuse me, of sentences called the Distica Catonis or Dicta Catonis, so the Cato's sentences. These were they were essentially moral sentences in couples of Latin hexameters, and we don't even know who basically we don't know who the author of this was, and these were written essentially in the 3rd century AD and were quite spread in the Middle Ages, and there were many, eventually also in low medieval times, many versions that were also commented and so on. And then an encyclopedical work that had a great impact on society, that on medieval society, that is the De Noopsis Philologiae et Mercury, that is essentially the marriage of Mercury and Philology, of Philology and Mercury, sorry. It had a huge fortune in the Middle Ages, and this was a work by Marcianus Capella that had lived in here between the 4th and the 5th century. This treaty was extremely important because it basically was at the base of the of the distinction between the trivium and the quadrivium that basically was taught as this standard form of as omnicomprehensive form of say of knowledge in the Middle Ages. I don't know what a bad definition, omnicomprehensive form of knowledge to say. This was a sort of didactic treatise that was addressed to Marcianus' son, and it's actually was in the form of a prosimeter, that is essentially a mix of prose and different meters of poetry and of verses, as you want to call them, and there is a very allegorical nature of this work. So with the ascent of philology to the skies, to the rise of philosophy to the skies, accompanied by the liberal arts to marry Mercury that represented the eloquence. So it was the vision, and this work is essentially split in 9 chapters. So the first one is actually I'm looking here. What is this noise? What the hell? Excuse me. I closed the window because fucking idiots shouting in the street. So the first 2 books have to do with the marriage of philology and Mercury. The third one is the it's called the Arta Grammatica. So here it's the grammatic art, book 4, the Arte Dialectica, so the dialectical art, book 5, the De Rhetorica, so on rhetorics, book 6 on geometry, book 7 on algebra, essentially arithmetics, how you call it. Book 8 on astronomy, and book 9 on the harmony. So the maybe it's now it's not important, but however, the trivium, this gave origin, eventually was synthesized, eventually medieval times, was a base of synthesis, medieval times, of the distinction between trivium and quadrivium, the distinctive trivium, quadrivium. So these lower divisions of this 7 liberal arts, and so the trivium comprises grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the this name of trivium actually was not known before in Capella's work, but it began to appear essentially during the Carolingian Renaissance, and the quadrivium had been already used for other works. However, the trivium was distinguished with here grammar, logic, and rhetoric because these were conceived to be the essential of a classical education, as Plato's dialogues had basically already established, and this distinction, therefore, even though it was developed as a trivium in the Middle Ages, already existed from ancient Greece, indeed. So the trivium, by the way, is literally in Latin where trivium, that means it's a crossroad, where 3 roads meet, practically, from tri and via, so tree and road, and now I don't think we have to explain what grammar, logic, and rhetoric really are. Important here is just to look at the quadrivium, that instead, as we have said before, comprehended these 4 subjects or arts, that is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And these were taught after having learned the trivium in medieval education. Also in here, quadrivium means the crossroad of where 4 ways met. And this term actually had, similarly, as we were saying before, had existed probably from the 6th century. So, by the way, in the work of certain, either we don't know who came up with this, either Boethius or Cassiodorus. So actually, at the very end of the late antique world, and also because of these needs of that these authors were mostly oriented towards an encyclopedic view of the world, a need for setting new standards of education, because actually in late antiquity, and especially towards the very end, it was really understood that it's as if a new era was approaching. And this, if you take Cassiodorus in his work, there is a lot that was intended, in fact, to survive. It was felt that in the ancient world was going towards a sort of shipwreck, and these great minds, these great scholars, began to conceive, even to readapt the knowledge for the sake of making it survive into these new ages that were coming. This is a great point, actually, in history. Always, when there are massive changes of society, probably one of the greatest problems ever is to reshape, to transform education. At least education is, by itself, in many ways, one of the first things that really changes. And it's still, however, very important to know how to shape education from the new world. I don't like canons very much, even though I'm one of those people who is convinced that education should be always something very, very intense. Not just people are pretending today that People should stop doing homework and so on because it worked, I don't know, in some country. And yeah, if you want people who are ignorant enough to frame into a specific profession because you need that working force, yeah, that's a perfect model of education. I have a very different model of education, which is based on a very solid knowledge, structured knowledge that you can achieve only through a freaking lot of work, both quantitatively and qualitatively, in order to make people aware of what they want to choose, and in order to make them decide freely where they want to go. So we should all be educated in that fashion, in my opinion, and all equally in this sense. Maybe also with a bit of margin of personality, of customization, definitely, but lighting the amount of things to learn is it might be good if it increases in quality. There's always a balance like that, but it should be also aimed at, the more you can do, the better it is, essentially. The more you learn, especially. I wish I had learned much more than I did when I was at school, even though I used to study fairly a lot, but I realized that, if my education had been framed in another, at least had been built on other premises, I could have done much more, and so many other people at social benefit. Because I think really a great problem today is still people are too uneducated, and this is fine, in fact, if you let these people, well, now this is complicated, you're not interested. However, let's stick just to you're talking about the trivium, the quadrivium at this point, and by the way, at this time we're just the liberal arts, as we have seen, so with aside from the so-called liberal arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and then arithmetic, geometry, music, and geometry, there were also the so-called practical arts. There were medicine and architecture, which also in early medieval times, tell the truth, were not at all atrophic as we think. Actually, these were quite more eminently, in fact, practical arts, and were probably also much more practiced than we think, so that paradoxically the liberal arts were a bit more ideal. There is also to consider this factor, is that when given the the technological potential of the time, when it got to education, indeed, and education was so rare, also because indeed there were less opportunities to apply this this knowledge to something to something practical, and at the time, actually, a lot of practical knowledge was just taught by orally and through practice, apprenticeship. So even here, we don't have to confuse the liberal arts with, as if this was the only knowledge that existed, and there are people with just a bunch of ignorance who didn't know to do anything because they couldn't read and they couldn't study these things of rhetoric and this. No. This was an ideal and also even symbolical set of subjects that were conceived also with a big deal of ideological and symbolical meaning, given the view of the world, given what the divine perfection was supposed to be, but shouldn't let us believe there was no other knowledge that wasn't handed down generation by generation. And we know that there is a lot of submerged knowledge we know nothing about from those times. There still existed because we have many hints that it was there, and therefore never underestimate early medieval times from this point of view. Also, the also in here Plato had set the standard in the Republic this time. The I don't know whether also the other was the Tribune was in the I don't remember now, but however, this division of the quadrivium was implicit also in other, both from Plato but also in other Pythagorean writings that at the time in early medieval times actually were extremely famous. And very much studied and were still at the base, together with Platonism, basically of the main, philosophical direction of the Latin-Germanic world. Anyhow, you see how even single works at this point in the West could be so influential, how they could shape eventually genetically a particular civilization like the medieval one, just because that's what had survived. Just imagine this work had not survived, we would have not had the trivium and quadrivium as we know them. There would have been another very different development and systematization of medieval knowledge, and with all the effects on politics and society and so on. So, looking at this list I have outlined, we have objectively to admit that between the 5th and the 11th century there was, first of all, an exiguity of cultural material. So, a relatively few works on which the students, the scholars could exercise and verify their own the same knowledge and their own ideas, their own interpretations, and in this, as a consequence, also a contraction of in the use of functional contraction of grammar and lexicon. Because basically, and also this is on our field that, as far as you know, in philology is pretty florid, is really even to study sometimes how a certain word, a certain conception was present in this literary tradition of the Middle Ages. I studied one, for instance, I think one of the very last university exams I gave at the end was about the name of Valle in the, let's say, from the late antiquity to roughly the 11th century, and looking at how the Valle was intended here, obviously from a Christian point of view, because these were all the symbolism that could exist in the Bible. In these works we've talked about how they were reabsorbed chiefly from the Etymologies of Isidore of Seville, and now we'll also see. So looking at how the semantic shades of the term Valle existed throughout this several centuries actually, and first of all looking at how few we know them, and looking through the definition of this term and or the usage of this term, how the medieval mindset was changing relatively to the interpretation of this content of this symbol. It was naturally a symbol, a metaphorical symbol, because the Valle could be interpreted in many ways. I think of all, the idea of coming up and down, even from a spiritual point of view. Also the Valle as a refuge from the world. Many monasteries were built in valleys. I mean, it's this much you can find out actually through this, and just to tell you how wide really history is and how deep and far it can go. And this is what we're getting to, because we've mostly been talking about the classical works now that were preserved into the ancient world, and in parallel, together with them, there was the Christian production. And this is paradoxically said, I mean paradoxically, not really much if you think about it, but really the field that produced a greater dynamism in early medieval literature. the West had began to differentiate a little bit from the East already in late antique times. North Africa, especially the African province of more or less today's Tunisia and eastern Algeria, had represented the diamond point of the Christian philosophical production in late antiquity. Africa at the time was one of the most intensely Romanized provinces. Was also one of the most populated, one of the richest, and in this sense the one that produced more in cultural terms. Think about personalities like Tertullian or Saint Augustine. So you know who they were. I mean, Tertullian was this. He actually lived between the second and third century BC. So actually, even consistent before Saint Augustine. His name was actually Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullianus. Sometimes I don't remember whether in English you say Tertullian or Tertullianus, like in Latin. I don't remember. So he was an apologete and writer. He was a Christian, and he is considered the father of the Latin Western theology. That in this in these regards was already differentiating as early as in fact the second, third century A.D. from the great theological speculation in the Hellenic East. So he was one of the greatest writers of Latin literature, into which he represents an important watershed, because he basically created, at the time, was one of the first authors to create an ecclesiastical Latin, because up to those centuries the church had mostly spoken Greek, because actually Christianity has spread in this most urbanized world of the Mediterranean, who largely spoke this Hellenic lingua franca, let's say. One of the most important. He also was not born a Christian. He converted to it. Probably his greatest work is the Apologeticum he wrote in 197 AD. And then Saint Augustine, that I don't think we have to present. He was actually Saint Aurelius Augustinus in Latin, doctor of the church, philosopher, theologian, bishop of Hippo Regius. It was one of the most important, after Carthage actually I think was the most important city in Roman Africa, at least in the Roman province of Africa proper. And he was born in Tagastes, in Numidia, today's Socarrás in Algeria, in 354, and he eventually would die during the Vandal siege of Hippo, that is today's Bona, actually, in August 28, 430 A.D. And he is one of the great of the major four doctors of the church, of the Western Church, and he's called the Doctor of Grace, as his doctrine naturally would inspire, especially this debate, and based on that was mostly renowned naturally also for Luther, and there was a great bond also between St. Augustine and St. Paul. And so his work marked the history of European religious religion and philosophy as a whole, telling the truth. So together with Gregory the First, Ambrose of Milan, and Saint Jerome, he's definitely possibly also the most important of the doctors of the Western Church. And this is important to say because the East was living in a completely different fashion at this time. I mean, let's not be so categorical. I mean, it had different models. While eventually St. Augustine remained a bit the base of the West. First of all, in the East, St. Augustine was watched also with less enthusiasm because his theories were, his a bit. Now it's complicated to explain. It's a bit borderline. In the East, there were figures like Saint Basil that were much more influent and that maintain a greater cultural impact. So, at this end of late antiquity, the West and East were also revolving now around different cultural centers, different regions of the Mediterranean, and the West was already shaping a bit. The western half of the empire was shaping culturally a little bit on its own, even from a Christian base. Roman Africa had been the place where the first Latin Bible had been produced, and we also in here we have towards the mid of the 6th century the last evidence of a consistent movement of books from the African province towards Europe. So even in the same West, eventually there were bigger chunks that were going to be split. Africa essentially at this point would remain into Byzantine hands until the Arab conquest, and because of this, Europe remained practically undetached from it, and stopping to communicate with it. That was here the history of Roman and Vandal Africa is very fascinating. But let's say this closer center of culture that had produced so much in late Roman times ceased to also in here to be a florid center from the mid of the 6th century, and it basically grew undetached from the rest of the western provinces. Not all at once, naturally, but consistently, and the great late antique cultural production died out progressively also in Africa. And at this point, so there is, in fact, especially with the this interruption of the direct contacts between the two shores of the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire was basically ruling on both the North and South Mediterranean at this point, but he was contracting. It was contracting as well. So even at this point, after the Justinian's reconquest, the great even the great wealth, the great prosperity, the flourishing state of these regions like Italy or Africa had basically sensibly declined. So, okay, these lands were reconquered, but then the war had caused a lot of problems. The society had changed substantially. The plague, especially the epidemics of specifically smallpox, was massively destructive. So the world, the late antique world, was about to transform effectively into a so-called early medieval one. So the main center of culture at this time in the West actually shifted to Visigothic Spain. Visigothic Spain was This is a very peculiar land because actually the Iberian Peninsula was quite diverse in its. It's always been brutally diverse in its parts. Also because it's pretty large region in itself. It's almost like France, I believe. I think the Iberian Peninsula is larger than France. I don't remember actually. I think France as a state is larger than Spain, but not of Spain and Portugal together. So yes, possible. Actually the Byzantines remained in the south of Spain seemingly up to the beginning of the 8th century, when the Visigoths basically seized also these last parts of Andalusia, and but the Arabs arrived after a while. And actually the Visigothic kingdom was that was main power in the Iberian Peninsula at this point, had a lot of troubles. Actually the monarchic power was pretty weak, and it got sensibly weakening. At the beginning it wasn't like that. The Visigoths had managed even to extend their power over their domination over the surrounding peoples, also the one of Portugal, of Galicia and so on, but eventually the power of this center had shrunk, and the reason is essentially the Romano-Germanic aristocracies prevailed over the monarchic power. And this didn't mean that was a decline overall, because on the contrary, these aristocracies maintain a great deal of a Roman legacy in their culture, so they were very intensely Romanized, and they could control the monarchy, and especially the great councils of Toledo that I made a video about. If you're interested, you can go check that out. I also have a medieval Iberia playlist. You should find it there. I haven't made many videos on medieval Iberia, unfortunately, but let's see. And that explains a bit how important these councils were, and the control of this aristocracy was also controlling the church. The Roman legacy entailed in this context also a high degree of education. So Spain was one of those places where late antique culture took more to vanish, essentially. Even more than, because France eventually declined, in the sense that it declined together with the Merovingian dynasty as well, but that was a bit more complicated because actually the Gallo-Roman elites didn't take over properly, as the Merovingian dynasty, even if split in 4, was able to maintain a greater control. The Franks had wiped out also these southern Gallic kingdoms, including one of the Visigoths that had been, in fact, basically moved their center of their power into Spain. They kept just Septimania as a tiny stripe of land, but I mean, in the rest of Gaul there was no other major center of political center that could attract so many intellectuals and so on. The main center of power is in northern France, that, unlike central and southern France, did decline much earlier, let's say declined in the sense that it contracted a bit more, like it was like more of Northern Europe as a whole than Southern Europe. Italy got wiped out by the Greek Gothic War, and then the Longobards arrived. They were completely on another mindset. So Spain was in many ways actually the only, say, center to which the late Roman culture didn't die out, and being coupled actually with some functional, can say central institutions, but at least institutions that controlled a court, controlled these major councils in Toledo, and so on. So that's why at the beginning of the 7th century, there is, of the 7th century, there is a last moment of great cultural and relevant cultural production, especially with the Etymologies of Isidore of Ceviche. The Etymologies are essentially an encyclopedical work. It's just to make it what it is. I mean, this had a huge success in the Middle Ages. Basically, it's as if now you had the etymologies were the early medieval Wikipedia. Like just now, you want to know something, you click on you Google Wikipedia and you go read whatever you want. But for the early medieval times, the average Christian wanted to know something about knowledge about everything. Open up Isidore of Seville Etymologies and looked at that. And this was added in value in the sense that Isidore was a saint as well. So he was another of the most important doctors of the church. He lived between roughly 560 and he died in 636. So Isidore is one of the greatest, the most relevant exponents of medieval culture. He was essentially a tireless, I don't even know how to define it, probably a compiler, tireless compiler of encyclopedical works in which he basically collected and handed down all the knowledge of the time. And naturally, the starting point were the classical and Christian sources at the same time. So this huge work of even of synthesis, of conciliation between the two worlds, that had, as we've seen already, partly been done by the same Christians, but now was also very originally reelaborated in this enormous work, and that witnesses how the West was still capable of producing such great cultural literary constructions, let's say. And the Isidore produced actually lots of works, different works, and the Etymologiae, in fact, so the Etymologies in particular are definitely the most important of them all, and they start from they draw from extremely different sources, either classical writers, also late antique writers, ecclesiastical orders, and so on. So it's all together. And not only Isidore of Seville was also extremely famous for other, also for his episcopal activity, where he basically called up for the councils of Ceviche and in 619 and 625, and the fourth national council, the Visigothic Council of Toledo, in 633. And he was in fact a typical product of the Romano-Germanic world. He came from an Roman-Iberian family. He was an orphan. Actually, was educated by his brother Leander, and who was also Archbishop of Seville, to whom he succeeded in office around 600 AD. So these were all kind of elites, and this tells you why these were such educated people as clergymen also as well, and extremely powerful clergymen, because being Archbishop of Seville meant to be like a kind of a lord of some kind, so extremely powerful and influent, as well as educated individuals. and he really wanted to, and Isidore Seville is was operating in Spain, so actually in a place that, as we have said, had not suffered a brutal fracture like in Italy from the ancient world. It was as if the in this world more had been preserved. This is normal. There was no major fracture in Spain, no major destructions. At least was a system that still worked more or less on the Roman basis. During the Visigothic kingdom, it was very intensely Romanized indeed, and therefore probably much more of the ancient knowledge was known. Of the ancient sources had been preserved, and compared to other regions. So he also, thanks to the etymologies, he saved a huge quantity of the ideas and methods of classical culture and late antiquity that were getting dispersed, and he instead put together and allowed us to read. He actually didn't write anything particularly, in, let's say, he was just a great compiler. He really put lots of things together. He was a very intelligent person. He wasn't interested probably in writing something more original on its own. He really felt very much this idea of putting together, of saving, of creating a system. And he was eventually very interested also in all these authors' works, and he was also involved in these councils of Seville and the one of the fourth of Toledo, to these unification of the Iberian liturgy, and defining also the certain Trinitary and Christological formulas against the followers of Priscillianus, and he actually came from a family that was eventually all sanctified. Even his brothers were Leander, I remember, and Fulgentius, that are in fact saints, and his and their sister Florentine, who was a nun essentially. So the etymologies eventually were not even completed. They were eventually split in 20 books as they are today by another author, Brolius, to whom they had been sent. And the title of the etymologies is because is given by the fact that Isidore explains the terms starting from their etymology. It was actually a very good model, a very good method, as should be also being done today. And he distinguished between the etymologies that derive from nature, from the, let's say, the function and the purpose, let's say, and he also in here there would be to list all the various works, all the various books that are interesting. The first one is the there's 20 books. The first book is on grammar. That is still, so you see, a part of the trivium. The second book is on rhetoric and dialectics. So here completes the trivium, actually, for the first two books. Then the third book is on maths. So this instead is about essentially the quadrivium. It's called De Mathematica as a third book, but it actually includes the whole quadrivium. So maths, geometry, music, and astronomy. The fourth book is on medicine. The fifth on the law and chronology. Actually, it's better to say it in Latin because it's de legibus et temporibus. So it really has to do with laws and the times, literally. So these chronologies that were being compiled at the time for telling what history was about. The seventh book is entitled De Liberis et Officiis Ecclesiasticis, so literally the books and the ecclesiastical offices. The seventh book is De Deo Angelis et Sanctis, so about God, angels, and saints. So basically, this moves this stems as a sort of hierarchy, proceeds as a sort of hierarchy from the paradise to earth. The eighth book is titled The Ecclesiae Sectis, so actually it deals with the Catholic Church, the Jews, the heretic sects, the philosophers that are meant to be the pagan ones, essentially the prophets and the Sibylls. The ninth book is De Linguis Gentibus Regnis Militia Civibus Affinitatibus. So this is basically on the various languages, characters, say peoples as well. I think I would, but also really this is mostly about characters, sovereigns, cities, titles, and stuff like that. The 10th book is actually dedicated to etymology proper. De Vocabulis is called, so this is about the words. The 11th book is De Homines et Portentis, that is essentially about the relation with humanity, between humanity, I don't know how to say this, the prophecies, essentially, the predictions, and and even certain transformations that occurred. The 12th book is dedicated to the animals, and that are split between animals and birds. The 13th book is called De Mundo et Partibus, so it's actually about the physical world. It even deals with the atoms, with the elements, natural phenomena. The 14th book is De Terra et Partibus, so here more of a geographical. So you see how Mundo and Terra are Mundus and Terra are conceived in different ways. Like this book is about geography proper, so about the Earth, Asia, Europe, Libya, the islands, the hills, the mountains, even the caves and stuff like that. The 15th book is De Edificis et Agris. This is dedicated to architecture, public works, and roads. That is also very interesting because it kind of shows to us what 7th century Spain was still about in terms of public works that have been so important still in the Roman world and were partly still conceived as a matter of debate in this province. The 16th book is De Lapidibus et Metallis, that is the metals, about metals, rocks, stones, everything that could be. The 16th book is also another theme. It also resembles very much so here the classical canons, De Rebus Rusticis, so literally the matters of agriculture. The 18th book is De Bello et Ludis. So it deals with also, Isidore is very important. He starts defining certain war terms associated to war, and also discussing about games and law, so the juridical science. 19th book is de navibus edificis et vestibus, so about ships, houses, and clothes that are put together. I've never read it, so I don't know how he combines the two things, but the three things, but it's interesting nevertheless. The 20th book, De Domo et Instrumentis Domesticis, that is food, tools, and also decorative art. So a very important version and print of the Etymologies was the 1472 one, the Editio Princeps by Günther Zeiner, published printed in Augsburg. And other important, so this was actually something that was kept being read very intensely during the Renaissance. There are so many other prints from Strasbourg by Johannes Mentelen, I believe, from in 1473, in Cologne, sorry, by 1478 by Conrad Winters, and there was one very important one in Venice in 1483, in Basel in 1489, once again in Venice, and then in Paris, respectively in 93 and 99. So, however, this is maybe not so important, but just for saying how famous and widely read this work on the Etymology was throughout the whole Middle Ages and beyond. There's an impressive list of other works he wrote, but maybe it's too long, maybe it's not accessibly important, but just for saying that he's one of the great thinkers of the time, and he had an enormous influence on the history of the West. So Spain eventually had this very great watershed in its history because of the stupid dogs. Wait a second. Start barking for no reason between one and each other. The hell. So with Islamic invasion of Spain, there was a great change essentially in the production, this Spanish production. There was the interruption of the last Roman tradition in Spain. Just as much in Italy, this occurred with Longobards. So two words that objectively closed. So these were a bit like, these are together massive events that eventually also make history take in another shape, to make other centers rise. In this sense, it's interesting to look at also the rest of Europe, because for instance, what about Longobard Italy? What if what did happen when the Longobards seized the peninsula? Well, the preservation and the elaboration of a classical culture, both pagan and Christian, was carried out by the major chapters and the main capitular and episcopal churches, and by the monasteries. In this sense, the main interest of the abbots at this point into Italy was mostly the one of producing dogmatic texts that could be useful to fight religious controversies, disputes, essentially, because also Lombard Italy had at this point the Byzantine Empire actually next door, because the Longobards didn't make it to conquer the whole peninsula in one. So actually, at this time, the Byzantine Empire was a bit wavering in orthodoxy because of backing certain heresies, or at least trying to win their favor, not to make certain regions of the East rebel. So actually, the Longobards stuck with Rome, with the popes. They were pretty orthodox at this point. So it was a religious as well as political matters, because now the Longobards were trying to conquer those Byzantine lands that were left into the Italian peninsula. So they naturally wanted to back their their right to do it also on this kind of dogmatic on religious base. So this is part of the reason why there was this texts production. We know that in the extremely famous monastery of Bobbio, founded by Saint Columban, thanks to the allowance of the Longobard king Agilulf and his wife Theodolinda, we know that there were certain manuscripts of Cicero's Republic that, however, were in part now erased to be filled with doctrinal literature and conciliar decrees. So this is also pretty sad indeed, but at the same time we have to understand why this tells us so much about that world. I mean, these guys were not able to recognize anymore that was Cicero's Republic. They needed something to write on. They simply erased these manuscripts to reuse the support that was extremely expensive, and to write other things on it. So this is kind of disastrous, because Cicero's Republic is now, we have only a few, I mean not a few, but say however only some parts, because of this. It's kind of a shame, but those were those people's horizons, and we have to understand them historically speaking. It's an important historical datum. Talking about the Anglo-Saxon world, it was more peripheral. This is very interesting actually. They managed for some reason to preserve, actually especially in the monasteries, a greater quantity of classical texts. This can be explained actually because of the model that of the monastic models, because essentially Anglo-Saxon Britain had been Christianized through the Irish Church. So initially speaking, the Irish, that Ireland had not been conquered by the Romans. So one of the major consequences of this is that there were no cities. I mean, England had a few. England and Wales had certain centers naturally. Also, they died out quite easy. Actually, those were some of the regions, together with the Rhine Valley, where the cities kind of contracted the most at this time in the early medieval times. But instead in Ireland, there were no cities, and the bishops, differently from the rest of the post-Roman world, did not have their seats into their dioceses into a city, because there were no cities. So the diocese was within the same monasteries. So these monasteries were actually pretty detached from the rest of the world, because the majority of Ireland was actually pagan still, and the monasteries lived a bit isolated. So this probably brought to a greater preservation of the work that was there, because paradoxically in the city, that work, in this more active environment and so on, would have brought to more chances of dispersion, given the social complexity of things that could happen, clashes, need to reuse that work, wars and stuff like that. Instead, in this way, apparently certain classical works were safer in these monasteries, and actually this model of ecclesiastical administration was initially exported into England proper and adopted. However, eventually, especially during the full evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons under Gregory the First, and I made a video about that, and that is called... Wait a second. I think it's simply as Gregory the Great and the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. Let's say the Roman model, so of the ecclesiastical administration with centered in the cities, was exported. So eventually England grew to have this hybrid between the Irish and Roman model as well. So the monasteries in England also had always maintained a great importance as well. The point is, however, through this way, and also through probably also the injection of certain works during the time of Gregory the Great, that was this time still of great contact with the Eastern world, so with a lot of still of contacts existing between the West and the East. I mean, not lots of them, but still, especially through Rome and these more Byzantine areas of Italy, there's still it was still a solid connection between the Eastern provinces and its literary canons in Western Europe. The last, actually, was probably most the last channel, aside from that pool of Spain that we have seen before, but that was still, however, revolving now on its own. And this brought to the preservation of other classical, of actually greater quantity of classical texts into the British Islands. And this, obviously, true also the fundamental medium of the monk Boniface from the British Islands stemmed the movement that eventually brought to the first rebirth of classicism into the context of the Carolingian court. So that also the Carolingians highly benefited eventually from the presence of British scholars into their court, into their also as missionaries, as we've seen, to get a bit more educated, which is paradoxical, because indeed the Carolingian world was a bit closer to the Roman one than the Anglo-Saxon was, but still the Anglo-Saxon had maintained this kind of culture that is still, even conceived. I mean, many cultural centers in England still conceive themselves to be kind of the depositories of the classical legacy, with especially naturally for many other reasons, but stemming ideally from this early medieval times where the cultural influence of the British Islands was so high eventually, and so important as also as a Christian culture to evangelize, to Christianize wide areas of Central Europe and so on. So, talking about the Carolingian Renaissance, that I think I discussed in some video, but I think I made some video about it. The causes of Carolingian Renaissance, yes, that's a video that can enter into play now. The Carolingian Renaissance is not being probably a huge deal. It was now it's extremely complicated to talk about that in all the causes. So that's why I named to you that video, because let's say, to make it simple, the Carolingians had a great need of educational reform of their clergy, because they deemed it to be unfit for the imperial dignity now the empire had, the Carolingian dynasty had. And indeed, Frankish clergy was extremely ignorant, especially in those areas of the empire that had grown more distant from, especially in the eastern part, and people simply, these were clergymen who couldn't even read the Bible in Latin properly, so that they made this some of the worst, even doctrinal interpretations, like misreading everything. It was very fantasy, a very imaginative reading of the Bible, I say. And there is an importance, though, of the Carolingian Renaissance, because it represents a sort of watershed in the history of especially of the cultural elites in early medieval Europe. First of all, there is the great role of the Palatine Academy. So there's a circle of intellectuals that gather around Charlemagne. So that came, by the way, from many areas of Europe. Like the Carolingian Empire was extremely multicultural. There were people coming from all over Europe. In fact, from Britain, from Spain, from Italy, from all these other chunks of the empire as well, within the same Carolingian world, that were talking again together. This is very important in the history of Europe, because it's the moment in which also many different cultures that had going basically that were growing distanced over time, because basically they I discussed this in that video on early medieval literacy. This was a great differentiation also of the local cultural traditions, productions, and this entailed really, all these Romano-Germanic kingdoms before the Carolingian Empire were really very different from each other. They spoke different languages, they had different liturgies, they had different scripts. So they didn't understand each other. The Carolingians made instead this massive work of homogenization, from which also the Caroline the Caroline script emerged, and it's the one that we still use today, by the way. So just think about how important and influential Carolingian Renaissance was under this point of view. So there was the chance of not just of, first of all, making all these various areas of Europe, also for strictly not just cultural interests, but also administrative reasons, to understand each other. Because the empire was huge, there was this need of homogenization for the sake of government. But also it brought so many intellectuals from so many different parts of Europe to confrontate together. And it created this truly European cultural elite. So a cultural elite that no matter where you came from, if you were from France, from Germany, from Britain, Britain was not even in the Carolingian Empire, but so it was like that, or even Spain wasn't the Carolingian Empire, or from Italy, you could be, you were a truly European thinker. You understood each other, you knew how to write the books, to read the books that were produced even from the other side of Europe. You could have a dialogue, and this contributed crucially also to philology, because basically at this in this international circle was achieved a confidence towards the classical with the classics that at least from the 6th century was not known anymore. So this is very important, because having many minds that confrontate around one single text is a way to make those minds working better, to expand, to also to compete with one another, and therefore to produce new methods, new criticism, new skills, and therefore there was a greater attention towards this, even of the world of the words. So it was not just about understanding better the sources, but also to create new original literary texts, writing new poetry. Poetry was not something so developed in early medieval times. I mean, it was also a matter of different mindset. You know, that when we talk about this Renaissance, like the Carolingian Renaissance, the 12th century Renaissance, there is also a sort of a new humanism that pours in. In early medieval times, there is this idea that in early medieval times, for instance, the God was conceived more like the vengeful God, whose wrath was feared, so that people looked at the world as a darker, as an existence in a darker way, etc. So in these moments of, you know, coming together, a bit of a revival, there are also new, you know, more positive and more opened looks at the world, and trying to understand it, trying to figure it out in a more positive way, so with a confidence of you to be able to understand that world. So the poetry was, and verbal games and other virtuosisms of the written word, that in this sense, however, were also harshly criticized, because you know, the most rigorous Christian thinkers were starting to say, well, start to protest, because say, this is wrong. We shouldn't indulge in this engage in this to delight, to please ourselves in this with these games, because they're not actually aimed at a better understanding of the world. It's just a pure exercise, a pure witticism. It doesn't, it therefore is immoral, because we have a duty to actually study we have to study the Bible, we have to study the fathers of the church, we have to concentrate on the Christian way. This is like a divertissement instead. So it has also moral, I don't know how to say, it's morally frivolous in many ways. So also at this time there were certain nominalistic theories starting, you know, this game, what is the words mean, how we can use them, and creating these paradoxes. So all something that actually was not probably so massively widespread all over Europe, but mostly around this Carolingian circle of intellectuals, that however had a fallout also in the rest of the continent, and was, you know, kind of making it wake up also under certain points of view. But mostly important, the Carolingian Renaissance brought to happened also through another mean. It was essentially the foundation of new monasteries, the development of new episcopal schools, and episcopal and cathedral schools, and therefore multiplying actually even the presence of culturally active centers, of centers where culture could be elaborated. This was actually a policy carried out by the same Carolingian emperors, and it had many reasons because of this. The importance of the church in the Carolingian world is enormous. If you go into my Carolingian playlist, Carolingian Europe playlist, I discussed that if you're interested. And there were strictly political reasons for doing this, but they had this massive consequence for which also certain models of monasticism were kind of reformed, especially from an educational point of view. The Carolingian clergy was issued to know how to write, how to read, how to sing. So that's also music developed at this time. But especially it's a word that was expanding even geographically speaking. I mean, all these monasteries and new dioceses were being created in places, in regions of Europe where this hadn't existed anymore. Just think about Saxony. This entire chunk of essentially northern or central Europe to be, conquered by the Franks, to have cities founded, dioceses built, monasteries built, and these were centers of culture that were also aimed at controlling the population and therefore having a cultural influence on it. The Carolingian conquest in these pagan lands entailed a Christianization. Christianization has to arrive naturally through literacy, because you know how to read. You must know how to read the Bible. Naturally, that time was a wishful thinking for most of the population, but it still basically set that population on an intellectual horizon that conceived reading as and writing as a as a normal element, or at least an activity that activities were normally carried out by a certain class of the population. In that sense, the clergy that had also greater spiritual but also political meaning. And what I personally find extremely interesting about this is actually that the cultural dynamism promoted by the Carolingians was not interrupted by the so-called second invasions. This is very interesting actually, because it shows that the Carolingians that are often criticized, like what did ever the Carolingians did for us? Well, they actually left us a freaking lot of things. Most of all, they indeed there were certain. I mean, the Carolingian parabola was pretty. They rose from relative nothingness and they ended into relative nothingness. It's a brutal approximation because it's not true. Actually, the Carolingians were deeply chained to the world they were living in, and they came from a very solid, from a very specific background and set up a very specific background, and in the meanwhile they changed really the history of the world, of Europe, and consequently of the world at that point. But objectively, it's not that a lot remained of what the Carolingians had at least attempted to build. I mean, the same empire kind of vanished. At least, it was rebuilt eventually on other bases and so on. But the Carolingian Empire fell, and relatively quickly. So that's main criticism. But this major cultural fallout the Carolingians had triggered remained, and not even these tormented times of the 9th and 10th centuries, basically with all these invasions and so on, basically stopped the spread of culture, the creation of a sort of comprehensive European culture. And this is not banal to say, because actually between the 9th and the 10th centuries, many monasteries all over Europe were destroyed, either by the Vikings or the Hungars or the Saracens. So there were, and also some of the major centers of the time. Think about Monte Cassino, for instance. So all these monasteries that had also, from previously from Carolingian times, a history, a tradition, that had stored so many knowledge for the time, and when destroyed. So these were actually dramatic times. The Vikings were going to hit, specifically monasteries, because they were extremely wealthy, and they could think about even the various ecclesiastical furnishings and so on, all these treasures of the churches, and in gold and silver. So they were targeting them specifically. But even if obviously these destructions brought to a locally a temporary stop to the the to the development of cultural of centers of production of this new culture, the world system kind of still survived in the essentials at a structural level, and on the contrary was being enhanced at the same time. I mean, while the second invasions occurred, the Europeans were still building so much else. Slowly, also, in a pretty progressive way, but still structurally in a very capillary way on the territory. These were the centers like the monasteries, the dioceses were deeply rooted in the local community, on the local territory. They were a measure, an instrument of control. The local areas. So they were drawing also so many resources, and they were producing so much, also culturally speaking. And in telling the truth, this capillary net of monasteries especially, and but also of the same cities and courts and abbeys, was being very intensified also by the same invasions, because during these invasions naturally was a need of coordination for preventing these things to these invasions to overflow, to take over, to spread rapidly. So there was a lot of coordination. There was also part of the legacy of the Carolingian Empire, was very organized, especially from a logistical point of view. It was full of stocks of supplies, of fortified centers, and so on. So these now were being, with the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire, these were rising as autonomous centers, and some of them were also monasteries. Because, by the way, think that monasteries, abbeys, and so on, aside from the cities and castles, were fortified themselves. Everything that was built in stone at the time was a fortress de facto, and so these were places where physically a lot was also stored and saved and preserved, and these nets were extremely interconnected. I mean, these centers were extremely interconnected, and they shared also a lot. This never has to be forgotten in terms of literary development. And that one thing is to have one center, and one big center that maybe essentially has a contact with another big yet distant center. And so you kind of produce something that maybe is resounding and adjusted to these international relations, but then locally nothing much. And one thing is having essentially say a very weak central authority, a greatly politically fragmented world, and having many small centers in the sense that all communicate with each other. This is gonna bring to such an homogeneous I mean, obviously there are going to be differences, but this interconnection that is also, however, not at a short range, it's also at a long range. It starts being so much more homogeneous, locally speaking, in terms of cultural influences, starts being more complete, because every center kind of works on its own, has its own needs, looks what the others are doing, and learns fast. And also smaller centers are more efficient at, let's say, especially when they're not controlled, and they make an autonomous policy that also entails the need of surviving as an autonomous center, but even as for surviving from these invasions and stuff like that. It brings to have a much greater pressure, so that the local resources are used in a more rational way. in a more in a less dispersive way. So everything it could be taken also in terms of texts of knowledge that could be treasured and used, and at the same time was a great need, and it was carried out effectively in this way. So thanks to the Carolingians and their successors in these centuries, and thanks to and through these contexts, the availability of classical and Christian texts decisively and sharply increased. And there was the idea, the stronger idea between, say, after Carolingian times, that now there was a patrimony that was made up by such literary texts that around which the new organizers of culture really revolved continuously. So a great idea that came up in this mind, it was actually collecting these books. The monasteries at this time, for instance, a monastery we had 70 manuscripts, was like one of the largest centers of Western, so the largest Western libraries, let's say. And there was a race for finding books. It was understood that these books were precious, were something that could give power, that could give you means to look at the world, to regulate it, to interact with it, to back certain political prerogatives, to say, how are these texts inputted? These texts could back essentially certain royal prerogatives and imperial prerogatives, or the importance of the church, your own prerogatives. Even only the fact of having to deal, let's say, with writing and reading meant to have interests in certain fields, and in knowing how to behave or to interact, even on a legal base, and this and you see, in fact, that at this time centers like monasteries and abbeys were expanding, and bishoprics and were expanding as centers of power, with political as well as military power. So there is a sake of organization that responds to very practical needs, but it can be in this sense fluidified and regulated by knowing more, by reading more, by studying new ways of administrate also your properties. And so, for instance, in the Cluniac monasteries of the 10th and 11th centuries, you see that the trivium and quadrivium were studied. Also something we hinted at before, this relation that existed between the ecclesiastical and the lay world, that was traditionally, especially in the monastic world, conceived as a threat, because the sacerdote was dangerous. Monks had ideally to hide away from the world, not really to hide, because hide is not really proper, because the monastery had to remain visible in order to make let's say, to make an example. But generally speaking, the sacerdote was considered as a dangerous thing, even for the same meditation of the monks, for their spiritual activity and purity. But at this time, the monasteries were essentially opening at those, especially young people who came from the cities and from the countryside, to in order to allow them to get educated within the monastery. So there was a word that was progressively expanding also from within through these interconnections. And the imperial courts of this time, these were mostly the Ottonians, were actually elaborating a great propaganda that was essentially all stuffed with classical elements. Also because of the sake of the Renovatio Imperii, I've discussed about the Renovatio Imperii. I'm sorry I'm repeating once again this. I've done this and I've done that, but I'm arrived at one point to which Schwerpunkt is large enough to provide enough information about certain topics that can be useful indeed. So if I say things you don't quite understand, or you would like simply to know more about, just know that you can find such materials on my channel. I've dealt with Renovatio Imperii and with the Ottonians now a bit, and what you see is that there were figures like Vipo, for example, that was this writer and musician, actually was chaplain for the emperors Conrad II and Henry III. He was he probably was a Burgundian. He was probably because we don't really know. I think in Burgundy around the very end of the 10th century, and he died after the mid of the 11th century, I believe. And he wrote many chronicles, including, for instance, the Gesta Conradi Imperatoris. So, also in here producing a typically courtly, a work that was looking at, telling the deeds of the Emperor Conrad and so on, but also poetical works such as the Versus pro obito Conradi Imperatoris, once again. So this Cantilena Lamentationum, that was how sad it is that the emperor died, such a great person. All, here producing something that was propagandistic, to say, look at how this guy was great, stick to him. That's your emperor. That's being your emperor. Stick with his successors and so on. Also the Tetralogus, he wrote De Victime Pascali Laudes and other things, but you find it's great intellectuals that were developing at both in the ecclesiastical and lay world at this point. They were definitely very starting to get very well acquainted also with this whole spectrum of the current, of the available works, and especially the ones of classical legacy that were naturally more developed as models, because this is also a problem that if you read early medieval Latin, most of the times you don't find anything extremely refined. Language is simpler, not really so simpler to understand for us. Actually, paradoxically, it's much easier to read 13th century Latin than an 8th century one, at least in my opinion, because some of these later low medieval Latin was already very much influenced by vernacular, so they were writing in a way that was more resemblant to vernacular, and it's easier to understand. While in the 8th century, sometimes you find this Latin that you don't quite understand because it's full of, the grammar is so messed up, and the also certain words are kind of meaning you don't even understand how they don't even exist in classical Latin. So you start saying, what are these guys saying? So you have to enter into the mindset of who's writing and trying to figure out what he wanted to express. It's very complicated. But it's at this time instead, so in post-Carolingian times, that more or less even the Latin writing gets a bit more understandable. bit more comprehensible, and because it was proper, because these guys were looking at the authors like Virgil, the greatest Latin poet of all times, and that's like the peak of perfection of Latin poetry. So these guys were now studying it at a level that was more advanced, and they had more reasons, even to more reasons to, and they could apply that knowledge more practically, like in this courtly propaganda, for instance, and therefore, getting more refined and being able to understand that better and to teach it to others, and so that they could pass this knowledge on. And by the way, from this time onwards, Western Europe is really, Europe as a whole actually, but is rocketing towards this acceleration towards the lower Middle Ages. So we are in expansion phase, a phase of expansion that also produced this higher quality material. And naturally, especially the imperial propaganda in here was getting very developed, not just because much was the acceleration of this propaganda actually came up with the Gregorian reform and the clash for investitures that definitely also pushed the church and the empire to produce to duel at an ideological level with much more sophisticated weapons. But already under the Ottonians, indeed, the Renovatio Imperii was aimed actually, in fact, at taking back this imperial Roman glory and making it the cornerstone over which the Ottonian dynasty based its own prestige. So especially even the role of protectors of the papacy gave to this renewed picture of the Ottonian royal dignity a much greater prestige. So it's obvious that the models that were used came from ancient Rome, and in that case, and that's how the ancient culture practically came back to be used, full into use, and to represent a very important point of reference for Western Europe. So there would be a lot much to say, but this video is pretty astonishingly long today, and so we're stopping it for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.